to build the lives that we want to build, to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, and in fact to be the people that we want to be. So again, when I think about that, when I think about our mission, when I think about having everybody here, that's what really makes me proud to be part of this organization and to hold this event. And the only thing that I can say is that, well, I'm thrilled that everybody's here. I'm sorry to some degree why we're here, that we're here on the heels of the horrific events that took place in Charlottesville, and that's the thing that brought us together. And in fact, not only the horrific things that happened in Charlottesville, but in fact, kind of the aftermath of Charlottesville. And what I mean by that are the cruel and the callous things that I, and I'm sure all of you, heard on the news, read in the newspaper, read on social media, heard in coffee shops. And that was the truly frightening part of all of this for me. What happened was terrible. The debate that continued to ensue afterwards was what was frightening, and that's really the impetus for us pulling this event together tonight and kind of reminding us how important it is that when things like this happen, this is exactly what we need to do. We need to push pause. We need to come together to talk, to listen, to understand, and to treat one another with respect, even if we disagree. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And the way that I think about this is that, like a lot of other bad things that happen in the world, the events in Charlottesville aren't the thing that define us as a country. The way we respond to Charlottesville is what defines us as a country. The things that we learn and the way that we change because of things like that. And so that's precisely why we're here tonight, to have a dialogue. And this is what I've written. I'm going to read this. We're here to have a dialogue tonight, and so let's listen with open minds. Let's learn from people who know more than we do. Let's be willing to admit that we don't have all the answers. Let's stay focused on the issues and not try to dodge or distract. Let's open ourselves up to what others think, and let's be willing to accept one another's opinions, even when they're not the same as ours. And what I believe is that if we do this, this is how we, as a community and as a country, will heal. And so now it's my honor to turn this evening over to my friend, Orlando Sentinel columnist, Scott Maxwell.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all tonight, and it is really encouraging to see such a hearty crowd. Usually to get so many people inside of a faith-based facility, there has to be free food. So, or maybe an offer of absolution. That's how we do it. It's Presbyterian. It's not hard to earn either where I'm from. So, but it is great to be with you all, and this really has grown quickly. I think it was originally visioned in the other building with a room for about 50 people. That grew into 100 to 300, and I believe there's chairs for 500 in here tonight with people still coming in. So thank you. We know that there's a hunger for conversation because the past couple of years have been tense and divisive, but the past couple of weeks have been, well, downright frightening in some cases. So we wanted to provide a forum for all of us to talk, to learn, and to listen. And that last part, I think, is most important. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got about 25 years ago when I was at a journalism conference with another journalist here in the front row, when covering divisive issues of race, ethnicity, and religion, is stay in the room. That advice is both simple and often incredibly hard. If you hear something racist, it is so tempting to simply call that person a racist, or a bigot, or an anti-Semite, or ignorant. But I think we have to think about what it is we're trying to accomplish, what the goal is. Is it simply to label or attack someone, or is it to change a mind or open a mind? The only way you can do any of that is to stay in the room. So we want to thank all of you for coming into our room tonight. Tonight we have a couple of goals. We want to inform you and we want to empower you. We want to inform you about the laws surrounding free speech in this country. We also want to empower you about how to handle speech that is ugly, raw, or inflammatory. And we want to talk about ways that we all can respond, right here in our own backyards, to ugly words we may hear in Charlottesville, or Washington, or Tallahassee. We are going to talk about how we can make a difference. And to do that, we have a great panel, which I'm going to introduce to you now. First, and I'm going to introduce them, give you their background, and then each of them is going to say just a little bit about who they are and why they're here. And I'm not going to do it in any particular order, but I'm going to start right here at our second seat with Orlando Police Chief John Mina. Yeah, go ahead. Give him a big round. Chief Mina got his start in service as a military police officer with the 82nd Airborne Division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He came to Orlando in 1990 to attend the police academy, and since then he has worked in OPD's Patrol Division, Sex Crimes Division, Crimes Against Children Unit, and a member of the SWAT team, you name it. In 2014, Mayor Buddy Dyer tapped him to become chief of the police department, and since then he's also served as a member of the Florida Chiefs Association, the organization that just this year chose him as this year's outstanding chief. Ladies and gentlemen, John Mina.
Thank you, Scott. Good evening. It's an absolute pleasure to be with all of you here tonight for this very important and timely discussion and conversation on free speech, hate speech, protests, and rallies. And as chief of the Orlando Police Department, I hope to provide my insight on how we respond to these protests in the city of Orlando and really in all of Central Florida. We've had experience with many protests, rallies, and marches, and many of them have gone really unnoticed because for the most part they had been peaceful and really have had to make zero arrests on the number of the last protests we've had, and that's because of the professionalism of the police departments in Central Florida, the training, the preparation, and how we prepare. So that's my role, I think, here to really educate everyone on how we deal with these protests, because I'm certain, as you have seen, that we will see more and more of them, and our job is to protect everyone's right to freedom of speech and also provide safety and life and liberty. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. All right. Down the second from the end, the only one with purple hair, we have Angela King. Angela has a unique perspective in this group, is that she used to be a former violent far-right extremist. Growing up in South Florida, Angela struggled with her identity, and some of the messages she received from her church and her family on issues like sexual identity and racial stereotypes sent some bad messages. She felt disenfranchised, and Angela began acting out and felt welcomed for the first time by a group of skinheads. Angela was arrested in 1998 and sentenced to 6 years in prison for her part in an armed robbery of a Jewish-owned store. She was released from prison 3 years early in 2001 for good behavior. Since then, she has graduated from the University of Central Florida with an MA in Interdisciplinary Studies, and she now works as a keynote speaker, consultant, and character educator. Angela King.
Hello. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with all of you, and thank you all for coming to listen and to take in some stuff that's really hard to deal with and really hard to see. But what I want you to know more than anything is that there was a point in my life when I dehumanized myself, and I did so to such an extent it made it acceptable for me to do it to other human beings. But I got a second chance. I was rehumanized with kindness and compassion from individuals I felt I least deserved it from. So the reason I'm here tonight is to uphold promises I made when I regained my humanity. One of those promises is to bear witness to what is going on around us. Another promise is to make sure that the atrocities that happened in the Holocaust never happen again.
Thank you, Angela. All right, and down here closest to me, we have Mitch Bloomer. Mitch Bloomer is the resource teacher at the Holocaust Center and an Orange County public school teacher who for 23 years has worked here. As a historian, he uses the history and lessons of the Holocaust in order to help students understand the consequences of prejudice and hate. Mitch also produces teacher's guides to encourage the full use of the Holocaust Center's programs and services, and has attended a number of professional institutes, including one titled The Bill of Rights and the American Political Tradition at Florida State Center for Professional Development and Public Service. Mitch Bloomer.
You know, in my job, one of the things I do, I won't say get to do because it's not a pleasure, is I teach a lot about the Nazi movement. And last weekend in Charlottesville, there were people who were marching in a torchlit parade, yelling, "Jews will not replace us." And regardless of what those people say about themselves at other times, at least at that moment they were neo-Nazis. And I believe that we can learn something from the original Nazis to help us figure out how to respond. Now, it's true that there are some things that we might like to do impulsively that turned out not to be effective. There were times in the 1920s where the Nazis were outlawed. There were times where their leaders were not allowed to speak. There were times where their uniforms were forbidden, and none of those things stopped them. And it's also true that these protesters in Charlottesville, they engaged in hateful speech. There's no doubt that when they shouted, "Jews will not replace us," that they were anti-Semites. But our public response has mostly been to criticize them for hatred and for violence. And I do believe that one area that we may have fallen down in that we need to address is to actually confront their ideas. Because the original Nazis gained a lot of benefit by relying on street protest and violence. Many of their followers saw them as attractive because of their violence and because of their action. They appealed to emotion. They didn't appeal to argue their ideas because their ideas were weak. And if we want to oppose these groups, we have to oppose them on their ideas as well as criticizing their hatred and their violence. The truth of the matter is that these folks believe that they are under assault. And so when they are out in violent street protests, they can play the victim. But there is no white cultural genocide going on. And our impulse might be to reject those folks and say, "You're not part of us." But a better response is to draw a circle around them and say, "You are part of our community, but not exclusive, the exclusive part of that community." So we have some challenges in front of us, and I hope tonight we can talk about how to strategically respond in a way that actually accomplishes the goals we hope for when we come into a room like this.
Thank you, Mitch. Up next, we have Terri Day, a professor of law at Barry University. Professor Day teaches constitutional law, specifically First Amendment, which she has written a good deal about and having work published in numerous law reviews as well as Fortune magazine. She's also studied and worked in the areas of social work and the media and co-chaired a project that documented the testimonies of Holocaust survivors, co-producing a documentary on the subject. Terri Day.
Thank you. I'm so happy and honored to be here. I am so happy to be with such distinguished panelists and such a wonderful turnout. I'm very passionate about the First Amendment. I think what I can add tonight, hopefully, is to talk about what the First Amendment law actually is, what is constitutional. Most people don't understand that hate speech is a species of offensive speech. The Supreme Court, for all of its First Amendment jurisprudence over 150 years, has pretty much, not always, but pretty much protected offensive speech. And so why should we, as a constitutional country, why should we protect hate speech? What is the purpose? Why is it that many of our allies overseas who protect strong, robust speech rights, they outlaw neo-Nazi speech, speech denying the Holocaust. They outlaw the buying and selling of Nazi memorabilia. And as Mitch said, you know, at one time in our history, we did it too. But one of the things I would like people to think about, and I hope that we discuss tonight, is the First Amendment is about government infringement on private speech. Do we want government telling us what ideas are good and what ideas are bad? Thank you.
Thank you. Up next, we have Senator Geraldine Thompson. Geraldine Thompson was born on the Bayou in New Orleans, Louisiana, before traveling to Florida, where she enrolled at the University of Miami in Coral Gables. Shortly after that, she enrolled shortly after the school ended racial segregation. She earned a bachelor's degree in journalism. What were you thinking? But also a business education, so smart. There you go. Here in Central Florida, she has been a teacher in the Orange County Public Schools and later became a member of the state legislature, a member of both the House and the Senate, serving, I believe, as the minority leader for a while in that chamber, if memory serves. Geraldine Thompson.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I think growing up in this country, many of us have been exposed to the notion that sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt us. I think you've probably heard that. But words have power. And so we're here tonight to talk about the power of words and how do we get from free speech to hate speech. And one of the things that I think that happens in society is that we enable hate speech when we deny the existence, when we deny the contributions of certain individuals. And I'm the founder of the Wells-Built Museum of African American History and Culture in Paramore, because I know you've heard the saying that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And so not much has been included in our libraries, in our history books, in our curriculum, in our lesson plans about the contributions of people of African ancestry. My husband and I returned from a 2-week stay in South Africa last week, and we were at a restaurant, and one of the staff members was an African, and he said, where are you from? Because our speech was different. And we said, we're from America. And he said, I did not know that there were people of your complexion in America. So we're exporting the idea that Americans are homogeneous and they look and they sound and they behave in a certain way, and that is not the case. So I think we have to understand that when you deny the existence of individuals, that leads to stereotypes. If you don't have facts, you generalize and you stereotype. And it escalates from stereotyping to discrimination. And discrimination leads to demonization, ostracism, and if you can demonize a person, it's easier to annihilate them. So words have power, and I'm glad to be here to participate in this discussion, and I'm glad that you're here as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I see there are a number of people standing in the back. We have some chairs, a lot down front, especially down over here on the left. Most of those people smell very good. I talked to some of them beforehand, so feel free to snuggle in there. The last person I want to introduce before we begin our discussion is Rachel Allen. Rachel is a lifelong educator who now educates about and advocates for peace and justice in her role as director of the Peace and Justice Institute at Valencia College. In her role as a community and peace builder, She has studies with peace builders from Notre Dame, Berkeley, and the Eastern Mennonite universities. She has worked locally with groups like Shepherd's Hope, the Coalition for the Homeless, and the League of Women Voters, who I know happens to have a big contingency here also tonight.
This topic is so important to me. So, you know, when I got married when I was 23, we read from the Hebrew Bible, love is patient and kind and never boastful. And I was none of that, and I knew it. And I went through a process of my own personal recovery. I'm 22 years sober. And in that process, I had a desire to become a loving woman because I knew I wasn't loving. And my circle of influence was Valencia College, where I have taught for 20 years, and I love Valencia College. And I work at an institution that has allowed me the opportunity and colleagues who are in the room to build what was once an initiative and now is an institute where practitioners, people are coming together to understand, study, and then teach nonviolence and do the difficult work of looking inward and examining who am I and who am I in relation to you and how can I make this community a better place. And my nerves come from the fact that now I see advisory council members walking in the room who I admire from the community and others who I've had the privilege to work with. But then I'm given so much hope and inspiration that this community in particular, on the heels of such a great tragedy we experienced 1 year ago, have the opportunity to make such a profound impact in our country and the world. So I'm glad we're all here tonight, and thank you, Scott, for allowing me to be here.
Thank you. All right, we're going to get started with our conversation here. Before I do, I want to let you know the format, because we do want this to be a conversation. I'm going to toss out a few questions that I've come up with, and the center has come up with the panel to get us started, but then we want to take questions from you all. And the way we want to do that, some people may not want to put their name to a question. There are cards. Mark, can you raise your hand and show us where they are? All right, they go to Terrence right back there. If you have a question, you want to write it down, you can do it anonymously. However, you can also put your name on it. And if you put your name on it, we'll call on you. And then you can go ahead and ask your question to the panel yourself. We want to make it a conversation. So I'm going to get started with them for a little bit, but then we'll take questions from you all. Feel free to fill out one of those cards and leave it with Terrence. But we're going to start with you, Professor Day. We're going to start with you about one of the topics from this past week that a lot of people have been asking, literally the title of this group today, the difference between free speech and hate speech. I want to talk a little bit about Richard Spencer, the leader of the white nationalist movement. There's been some misunderstanding about what happened last week at the University of Florida. UF didn't invite him to speak. Instead, Spencer had asked to rent space. And at that time, the UF president said the university, he felt obligated by the First Amendment to allow Richard Spencer to rent that space just like he would anybody else. The president said he didn't like Spencer's message, but that the school couldn't treat anybody differently because of their views. But after Charlottesville, President Fox said the university picked up reports of protesters who were coming to his speech with the intent of violence. That is the justification he used to deny Richard Spencer the chance to speak there. So, Professor Fine, does that cut the legal mustard?
Well, I'm in the uncomfortable position, because it's unpopular, to say that Richard Spencer had a right to speak at the University of Florida. What the university and many universities do, if they're state actors, they're subject to the First Amendment. They open up their facilities for a limited public forum or a public forum, but they open it up to private speakers. When government opens up its property to private speakers, government cannot discriminate between content of the speech, viewpoint of the speech, or the speaker. Now, if he obviously said that he was going to go to court, and in fact he did go to court, because in Auburn they weren't going to let him speak. Same situation about the limited public forum, and the court ordered the university to let him speak. When the university or government denies a speaker because of who they are or what the subject is or what the viewpoint is, then the government has to justify it with what we call in constitutional law strict scrutiny, or with very compelling interests. And to support the president of the University of Florida, and as he said, to promote safety is certainly a compelling government interest. But when government stops speech before it happens, then we're also in very difficult territory in terms of prior restraints. So it's very difficult.
So if you're judge in that case,
I'd say he should speak.
okay. Anybody disagree or have another thought?
My thought would just be that, like in that case, I know that was canceled because not of the views or the speaker, but because of the likelihood of violence and being in public safety. That's what we want to prevent. We want to prevent the likelihood of violence, and I think in some cases it can be well documented that there will be a likelihood of violence, and if people are getting hurt and people are getting killed, I agree that is the right decision.
Fair enough. Mitch?
Sure. And on a public safety level, that certainly is true. But on a societal level, the idea of free speech is that if somebody has an objectionable idea, it's better to get it out in the open so that we can hear it and object to it and refute it, rather than to have it fester in silence beneath the street, so to speak. And what that does is it takes the onus of responsibility off of the government to decide what's acceptable and what's not, but it puts the onus of responsibility onto our shoulders as citizens to speak out against hateful ideas that could lead to violence or to harm. And if we neglect our responsibility, then we've let our society down. And that, I'm afraid, happens. You know, the objectionable ideas are put out there and then we don't respond. Or we respond inappropriately. Somebody will come out and they will create violence of their own so that someone can't step up and speak. And that doesn't really serve the cause.
Angela, I believe you had mentioned before, as a former member of an extremist group, that some of your group, they liked nothing more than being shut down.
That's true, and I'm so torn between these issues. One of the things that we used to say all the time was good publicity, bad publicity, no matter what it was called, it was good for us. So if we were out there able to spread the message that we were trying to get across, if someone told us no, that gave us the reason to say, oh, we're the ones being persecuted. Doing the work I do today, though, I have to ask, and I support free speech, but I wonder to myself, at what point do we draw the line between free speech and the loss of human life?
Well, speech stops to be speech when there's conduct and criminal conduct. So I think people get tied into a breach of the peace or violence with First Amendment and free speech. The First Amendment does not protect a breach of the peace or violence or harm or legitimate threats of harm that will imminently lead to harm. So, there is a difference between speech and unlawful conduct. Now, Mitch and I had a conversation going over the email, and many of us were involved in it also, about where is that line? And that's a difficult line to draw. And the Supreme Court and the First Amendment jurisprudence has struggled with where the line is between speech that should be protected, again, by the government, or I don't want to say protected by the government, but not restricted by the government. I'd like to say one other thing. I see our free speech as freedom from government infringement, freedom from government to tell us what to think, how to feel, what's in our hearts. And so I'd like to echo Mitch's comments about, ideas are, even though words can hurt, and I recognize that, but ideas are something that the First Amendment does protect.
Rachel, I want to take this one step further. Go ahead, Carol.
As you heard in the introduction, before I sought public office, I was an academician. And I believe that the Academy is a marketplace of ideas. This is where you hear ideas that you may not agree with. And I think as individuals, we have the choice in terms of what we expose ourselves to, what kind of speech do we expose ourselves to. So while Richard Spencer might speak at the University of Florida, it doesn't mean students have to come. We saw that at Bethune-Cookman University when the commencement speaker, who had said that HBCUs were examples or forerunners of choice, really. There was no choice, and so they had to establish their own institutions. But the students who were there for commencement decided that they were not going to give the Secretary of Education, who was the keynote speaker, their attention. And so many of them turned their backs. Many of them left the room. And while we may have people who come and present ideas, it doesn't mean we have to listen to them.
It was very gracious of you not to say that secretary's name. It's Betsy DeVos. Rachel, I want to take this to the next step of this same topic. So we have sort of, I think, agreement that Richard Spencer, for instance, the speech should be permitted. You run a Peace and Justice Institute. What do you do? Somebody comes to you and says, somebody's bringing speech I really don't like. How would you tell them to react?
Well, the vision of the Peace and Justice Institute is all people, all voices, all matter. And really was kind of an inspired vision. And on one hand, it sounds pretty good, right? But early on, colleagues would say, well, what if a neo-Nazi shows up in my classroom? Do I really want to give that person voice? Do we really want to listen to them? And we've grappled with this for a long time, and it's amazing that here we are 10 years later, and the neo-Nazis have shown up and made their voice clear. And we stand by this response, which is, yes, we do give them a voice. And if they want to come and speak on campus and the students want to hear this voice, we need to hear it. And I've been concerned with this, frankly, a lot of criticism around young people today and college students, because when we talk about safe space, there's a lot of criticism of safe space. At PJI, we create safe space, and you have a handout in front of you that has principles on the back, the principles for how we treat each other. That's how we establish our safe space. That space isn't established so that we can protect each other's soft hearts that can't handle anything. That space is established so that we can speak our truth. As ugly or pretty or difficult as that truth is, but that we have a space then for people to listen, to wonder at it, to check one's own assumptions about that person and their truth, to perhaps ask ourselves, why does this make me so angry when I hear their truth, right? So doing that inner reflective work. So I believe that at Valencia, we're going to welcome that difficult voice, but as Senator Thompson is saying, we're going to educate each other in how to move forward with that, how to approach it, how to listen, or as she's saying, how to not show up for it. We have a lot of power, and I think studying Gandhi and King was a great advocate of the First Amendment. And he said it is our American greatness, is freedom of speech. But I think the challenge that Gandhi gave us was we must be prepared. And I think that's what Mitch is saying. It is our responsibility to prepare and know how to respond. And we can do that together collectively. Whenever I have something like this, I could tell you the 10 people that helped me be up here today and prepare, right? I reach out to all of you who know more than I do so that I can be prepared. And that's our work.
So let's just explore that a little bit, and I throw this to everybody, whether to show up or not to show up. That was the debate Tina Fey sparked with their sheet cake eating video. Some people wanted a mass of 1,000 people to protest the Nazis. Tina said, ignore them completely. If the neo-Nazis started coming down Maitland, now that the downtown's finally being developed, what would you guys suggest they do?
Well, we had an incident maybe 10 years ago where skinheads decided to march in Paramore. You all may remember that. And what I talked with the residents about is what they want is violence. What they want is an altercation. What they want is a confrontation. And we don't want any of you to be arrested. So I'm suggesting that you stay home. And if you can't stay home, that you just be observers. And so we did have the Orlando Police Department who sent officers to be there while the skinheads marched through Paramore. So they chose Paramore deliberately, just as the Ku Klux Klan chose this center to demonstrate in front of this building, this very building here. And so they had the right to do that. And so I think we have to counsel individuals in terms of how they react to those kinds of demonstrations.
One of the things that struck me in the aftermath of what happened in Charlottesville is I was listening to an interview of the rabbi from the synagogue in the city, and one of the things he said struck so true. He said, part of the problem with public discourse today is it's shouting back and forth, and it's us and them. And you know, that is a real problem in terms of, and that's part of what we've talked about on this panel, what is the personal response? Does shouting back and forth really further the purpose of the First Amendment, which is public discourse? We don't listen, we don't really respond, we're just shouting. And so I think what Rachel does at the center, you know, I think we can all learn to develop some skills to be able to listen, even if we can't change somebody's mind, and I'm not sure, you know, you're going to change a neo-Nazi's mind, but just to try to understand where is that person coming from.
Mitch?
We deal with this here at the Holocaust Center sometimes because we encounter Holocaust denial. And it's a long-standing wisdom, I think, to not engage Holocaust deniers in debate, because you can't debate with someone who's willing to lie about the facts and make things up as they go along. On the other hand, and I would say we don't want to give free publicity to these hate groups, but when they do manage to get themselves on stage, we can't let their presence go unchallenged. So then we do have to respond. Now, on a personal level, I would say we should probably seek to avoid as much as possible a public engagement that would give to them an equal place at the table. But that does not preclude the idea that we can reach out privately, one-on-one, engage people in a conversation outside of a public setting, because there are people who espouse these views who can be won over. And we want to do that if at all possible. We just wanted to take the heat out of the situation and the politics out of the situation so that our interactions can be the most productive and the least likely to be manipulated to the benefit of the group that we oppose.
Chief, can you talk a little bit, yeah, I was waiting for you to take a drink and then ask you a question, about those interactions. How do you all decide when protests are getting heated? I know there have been any number in the past 4 years since you've been chief, or 3 or 4 years, interactions that we thought might have sparked violence things, but I think you've had very few arrests. How do you keep those down, and what do you decide when you're going to arrest somebody?
Well, so law enforcement in Central Florida does a fantastic job, and we don't monitor groups, we monitor activity. So we learn through various methods of protests, and many organizers will come directly to us We meet with those organizers. And many times we meet with people who are going to be counter-protesters. We kind of lay down the rules and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in any type of protest, rally, march where there are going to be opposing views, and many of them are. We go through great lengths to keep both sides separated. You saw that in Boston. The Boston Police Department did a phenomenal job of keeping the sides separated. You know, our job as law enforcement officers is to really remain neutral, be professional, not get caught up in sometimes the tension that we see. Law enforcement around the nation is keenly aware of what is going on, what is happening at some of these protests. Here in Central Florida, specifically in the city of Orlando, like I said earlier, we've had many protests, some as small as 10 people. We have them every single week downtown, to as many as 500, 1,500, and as many as 5,000, with really no arrest because they all remain professional, peaceful. Now, what does happen in a lot of these protests and some counter-protesters and protesters, there is always a very, very small percentage of people who come to agitate, and people come to make things worse. We do a very good job of trying to identify those people and stop the activity. So we're there to prevent violence, to prevent the threat of violence, the likelihood of violence. And so I think you should be very proud of your Central Florida law enforcement. They do a very good job. All of the law enforcement agencies in Central Florida all trained together, very well prepared and well equipped to handle any type of protest that you've seen nationwide. And many of the things that you will see at our protests, and there will be many things that you don't see that we do behind the scenes, and we don't like to give up our tactics and everything we do, but we go through great lengths to maintain safety for really all involved.
Thank you, Chief. We've got so many questions from the audience, and I think we're going to get to those in just a minute and get them started, but I actually wanted to go to Angela because you can talk about whatever you want, but I want to give you a little time for one particular thing that I think a lot of people don't understand, that you've talked about. People aren't born to hate. And I think you talked about many of the people that join these extremist groups don't join because they hate. They join for a different reason. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can, but can I talk about what I want to first?
Yes, you can talk about, I'm going to get out of your way.
I wanted to echo some of what Senator Thompson mentioned. Violent far-right extremists, any kind of violent extremist, they are trying to provoke a response. So if we look at that in the way of them trying to provoke a particular response from us, shows that they have some amount of control over our response to them. I think we can all agree we don't want to be controlled by violent extremists. So one of the things that we try to do to take the power back is to build resilient communities. And the way we do that is by educating communities about what these groups are trying to accomplish, what is going on behind the scenes, what do they want from us. And essentially, I'm just going to say this, it sounds a little scary. When I was involved more than 2 decades ago, what's happening right now today, the violence we're seeing, is what I was actively working to make happen then. And I think it's pretty clear to see that these groups have been emboldened right now. They are not going to back down. So I think one of the best things we can do is become an educated community, because in that we become resilient and we take the power back from them. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you. And now I'll answer your question. Okay.
Why do people seek out these groups?
To be really honest, for a long time, we didn't have answers about that because we weren't thinking to ask people who walked away from it. We were thinking to ask people who were involved in it, and that really doesn't work out well. So one of the themes that we've seen come up in research over the past few years is that there are non-ideological precursors to becoming involved in violent extremism. It is not the same across the board. We do see people come from dysfunctional homes, but we also see people come from healthy homes. Some of the precursors that we're starting to identify are trauma, abuse, bullying, looking for a place to be accepted, looking for love, looking for protection, and that is not to justify what ends up happening once those individuals find that place. But what we are seeing is they find whatever void they're looking to have filled. And once the group or groups has the hook in, the indoctrination begins. So people are not born hating. It isn't something inherent in human beings to hate. It's something that we learn. It's something that we're socialized into. And I think it all kind of comes back around to the same thing in what's being done here today, and that is to educate ourselves, to become aware, and that's how we're going to build resilience and take our power back.
Thank you, Angela. All right, well, speaking of education, I want to take our first question to an educator. Do we have Joe Malfara here? You want to come up, Joe? I'm going to do the Wayne Brady Price is Right thing. I'll come to you also. Joe, you get to come here because you came all the way from Poinciana. So God bless you for that. And also, I know you all start school too early in the morning. Call your school board members about that. Go ahead.
So me and my girlfriend are here tonight, and we... Right here? Sorry. Usually I don't use one of these. So we teach at a school full of children that come from minority groups. And I'm looking, and I actually made it known to them that this event was coming out tonight, and I was hoping that some of them would. They might be too shy right now, but I guess my question is, what advice would you give to these young people of minority groups to show not only white supremacists and these hate groups, but what advice would you give to people that maybe have a tiny bit of prejudice towards these types of groups, be it Hispanics or Latinos or African American? What advice would you give to them? That's my question.
Thank you.
I would ask them if they know any of the people that they are afraid of or decide they don't like.
I think I understood you to say, what do you tell the minority student?
And another thing, well, I think you mentioned on the card, what would you tell them about how they would change the minds of those who discriminate against them?
Well, as I said in the opening, I think if you don't know people, you generalize and you stereotype. And so it's important for all of us to get to know each other on a human to human level. And that means getting out of our comfort zone and getting into situations where we're among people who are unlike us, who are not from our own background. And it is not the minority students' responsibility to do that. I think the majority community has the responsibility.
And I agree with that, but I'd also like to say that, if I was going to talk to your students, the first thing I would say is that change is possible. Too often people say, oh, nothing will ever change, hate and discrimination have always been with us, so it's going to be here. But history actually demonstrates that hearts and minds can be won over. So that would be the first thing I would say. And then after that, I would suggest the idea that if we view participation in society only as competition, then someone who is different from you is your competitor, and maybe in a larger sense they're your enemy. But if our society is also collaboration, then the person who's different from you adds to your strength because they bring to the table diverse ideas and background that you may not have access to unless you create those bonds of relationship. So if we can kind of change our model from, in many ways, from competition to collaboration, we open the door to, instead of being worried about others being different, actually being enriched by differences.
I hope this story will resonate. We have a program called Orlando Speaks. We're doing it in Hillsborough now. So last week I'm sitting at a table with a young African-American male, probably a senior in high school at Plant City, a leader. And I tell the story of myself, which is being a white lady in an interethnic, interracial marriage, and kind of the waking up to whiteness process that I've gone through. And some of the comments from my family members, which were very racist. And later he told a story at the table about the risk he was taking to be friends with Josh, who was a white boy. And he'd gone to Josh's church on Wednesday nights, and he was really enjoying that church. And he was feeling belonging there, and he was liking Josh, and his friends were making fun of him. And quoting like a recent movie called Get Out, and saying that's what you're doing. And afterward, I went to shake his hand and tell him how much I admired him. He was an amazing young man. And he said, you know, you and I we're so much alike. Our story's the same. We're going through the same thing. It was amazing. I couldn't believe it. I think there's multiple messages in that story. Number one, how cool that the person I related to most at my table was this young man, and that how cool that this young man is crossing ethnic lines and really taking a risk to lose his friends, to do it, but empowering himself because he's going to branch out. And I told him the story that before I was married to my husband, who's here tonight, you came to Christmas Eve at my house, and it was all white people. And I didn't notice. You know, now if you come to Christmas Eve at my house, it's all different people. Actually, Muslims are there, and Jewish people are there, and there's Christians and atheists, and, you know, just different ethnicities. And I told this young man, I said, hopefully your life will be like mine, because it's a whole new world. And it's amazing. And I wouldn't trade it for a minute. And so I think that's what we can offer young people, is to cross the lines, build the bridges, because it makes for the better life.
Thank you.
I misunderstood the question. I apologize. And if someone could record that for me so I can just use it in the future, just to have that apology there ready to go.
Well, the good news is I believe this is being streamed, isn't it? And you'll be able to watch it. You can all wave to the camera, wherever it is. All right, we're going to change gears completely, but there are actually about 3 cards asking questions along the same lines. Not signed, any of them. Second Amendment rights, First Amendment rights. Can we limit open carry of weapons in protest events? Or another version, should free speech and free assembly rights be absolute in open carry states where people can come armed, ready for battle?
So I'll handle some of the open carry questions. And I think, fortunately here, at least in Central Florida and the city of Orlando, there is no open carry of firearms. So we feel very... I actually feel very lucky as your police chief that I don't have to deal with that, and we feel, I think we're very fortunate because in talking to, I've had several conference calls with chiefs from across the country, and many of them have had to deal with that issue, and some of them have been able to stop that by putting in ordinances specific to protests and rallies. So in other words, if the state or area has open carry laws, the city or jurisdiction has come up with ordinances to restrict those open carry laws during a protest at rally, and that is something they did in New Orleans. I just talked to the superintendent there, Mike Harrison. That's what they did. It was successful for them, and they said that the counter-protesters who came carrying firearms did leave the area when they told them they weren't going to allow them to open carry because of the specific ordinances they had in place.
I can speak a little bit about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. I teach constitutional laws as well as First Amendment. But I think one of the things that was so scary about the Charlottesville rally was the brandishing of guns.
Yep.
And so you have this mixture of guns and speech that is very offensive, very aggressive, and as Angela said, probably intended to invoke a response from the people that were there counter-protesting. You know, you get in trouble with the gun advocates and the Second Right Amendment, protectors. The truth is that just recently, a few years ago, the Supreme Court decided its first case in 70 years interpreting the Second Amendment. When I went to law school, we never even talked about the Second Amendment because it was sort of a dead issue. But the court did say that the Second Amendment meant that there was an individual right, but that case limited it very, very narrowly to having a handgun in a home to protect oneself in the home. The court did not go on to say people have a right to have a gun wherever they are and, open carry, concealed weapons, whatever. The court went on to say that its ruling did not mean that reasonable regulations on guns were now unconstitutional. So I think one of the frustrating things for me with, the talk about gun rights and gun control and reasonable regulations is people think that if government puts in some reasonable regulations that suddenly people are going to lose all their gun rights. No, that's not going to happen. So I think it's wonderful if cities and local communities put in special ordinances that prohibit open carry at demonstrations. And the Supreme Court hasn't spoken on it, but I can't imagine that that would violate the Second Amendment.
Thank you. And just in case you don't know, while your legislators are routinely trying to expand the places you can take guns, every single year they keep them banned where? In the legislature. So just that's one for you to remember that. All right, do we have Nelia, is it Nelia or Neela Wilson from Castleberry? There she is. This one's, I think, an interesting one.
Yeah, so my question really would be, what would be our social response if ISIS were openly recruiting in the U.S. via public speeches, and how are white nationalists any different?
One of you has to say something.
I'm the First Amendment advocate, so first of all, they are recognized as a terrorist organization, so they are labeled such. They're recognized. Congress has passed numerous laws that give the executive department the authority to list groups of terrorist organizations overseas.
Only overseas?
Well, if they're recruiting in the United States, there have been a lot of, Angela and I were talking about this before, there have been a lot of private efforts, so it's not government action, but internet carriers have refused or taken down, hate speech or recruitment from ISIS and things like that. But, it is a difficult question to ask, because if you're a purist, then you say it doesn't matter if it's ISIS or it's, neo-Nazis. The thing is that First Amendment has context. And so government can regulate even based on the content and the speaker, if the government can justify it under compelling government interest, and if the restriction is the least restrictive of speech to meet that compelling interest. And certainly with ISIS and home recruiting and terrorist activity, I would imagine that a court would say that government would have satisfied strict scrutiny that is required to restrict otherwise protected speech. So that's a law professor getting out of that one.
Mitch, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is that ISIS does recruit in the United States, but they have to be very careful doing it, because not only are they on government terrorist watch lists, but because their recruitment would find an extraordinary negative reaction from members of the American public. In other words, we also are part of the reason they can't recruit publicly and openly. They have to rely on the internet and the dark web and things like that. So to me, the question would be, when white supremacists recruit, why don't they get the same response from us that ISIS would? And rather than asking why doesn't somebody else do something about them, the question is, why don't we do more about them?
I think ISIS is a terrorist group that we need to be concerned about, but we also need to understand and acknowledge that Florida is at the very top in terms of the number of militia groups that operate in the United States. So we need to be concerned about recruitment right here. A number of years ago, I was in Oklahoma City and went to where there's a memorial now, and that was a homegrown terrorist who bombed the federal building in Oklahoma City. So while we are focused so much on ISIS, I think we also need to be focused on what goes on in the United States. After the Pulse nightclub shooting, I talked with the governor about getting some control of guns, and particularly military-type weapons. And he said that the problem was not with guns, but it was with ISIS. And I asked him if Charleston, South Carolina was about ISIS, and was Sandy Hook about ISIS, and the common denominator in all of that are the guns, and the fact that they are very easily accessible. And while we all should have the right to protect ourselves, I just don't understand why a private citizen needs a military assault weapon with a magazine of ammunition with enough rounds to kill hundreds of people. So I think we need to look inside as well.
All right, we're going to change topics here. This goes for Angela. This is written to Angela anonymously, but I think all of you can address it, because I think it's somebody who came here searching for answers about how they can act in their own life. Angela, when in a social setting, what advice do you have when you hear someone, whether a friend or not, speaking in a hateful manner?
That's a really good question, because that's something that we face often. I will use myself as an example. This is hard to do, but I think this kind of transparency is necessary if we're going to get through what we're seeing. I might be disowned for this, but if that's the case, so be it. Not too long ago, I was having a conversation with my dad on the phone, and he used a racial slur. And I told him if he wanted to continue having a relationship with me, that was not acceptable. And I can only be really honest in saying that was hard to say to my dad. It wasn't easy, but it's also not easy to see what's happening to my fellow citizens in the United States. I love my dad, even, racial slur and all, but I also know the cost of words. I know the cost when we use words to dehumanize others. I know the cost of human lives, and it was more important to me to tell my dad that's not acceptable, even when he tried to excuse it and say, oh, it was just a joke, because it's not a joke. Jokes don't lead to the loss of life. And honestly, it's not easy. It is not an easy thing to have to say to a loved one, that's not acceptable, that's not a joke. But these are the kinds of things that we have to stand up and say.
One practical bit of advice, in those circumstances, tell a personal story. If somebody makes an objectionable racial comment, say, oh, but you know, I have so-and-so as my friend, and that's not true about them. And if they had been here to hear that, it would have been so hurtful. And I feel like I have to speak up for them. Because what you just said isn't true for my friend. If you tell a personal story, it doesn't seem so confrontational and may get a little bit of a softer response than just thunderously denouncing somebody's racism. I'd
like to add one thing. I grew up Jewish in Sioux City, Iowa during the 1950s. And so there weren't a lot of Jews. We had experiences where there were swastikas on our temple. My grandma used to get calls saying there's going to be a Jewish funeral. My cousin was told by somebody in high school that her mom said she couldn't play with her because she was a Jew. Well, they were older, but they couldn't hang out together because my cousin was a Jew, and you know, Jews have horns. And really and my mother grew up in Martin, South Dakota. It's imagine Jews in Martin, South Dakota. You know, she had experiences of being rocks thrown at her, and her parents literally moved out of the city because they were concerned for my mother's safety and all the anti-Semitism. One of the things that my parents and my community always taught me is to let people know, because sometimes they don't really know that what they're saying is as offensive as you take it. And so, you know, there were, use of Jew me down and all kinds of things. And my mother really told her friends, or we told our friends, you know what that means, and it's, you know, it's offensive to us. And a lot of times, most of the time, the people were very appreciative of us sort of educating them in terms of how we perceived what the speech and how it made us feel.
Rachel, did you want to?
Well, the principles that are on the back of the sheet of paper you have there in front of you are really amazing tools to help us navigate some of this kind of conflict. And one of the most powerful ones related to what Terri was saying is asking a question. So when someone says something offensive, we can say, I noticed you said that, and I wonder if you know what that means. And because people don't always know. And one of the other principles is to, just slow down, take a deep breath before we attack the person, and we can speak our truth. You know, if it happens with a colleague, that it makes me so uncomfortable to be in a work environment where I know so-and-so in the cubicle over there subscribes to that religion. So I just wanted to tell you that I'd rather not be talking that way at work. I mean, it's a risk. It is a personal risk to say that, because, oh, now I'm the nerd, and now I'm intense. But I think as what other people are saying, Angela and Terri, it's a risk worth taking at this point, because we're all here to make our community a better place. And hopefully, you know, we're not going to lose a friend over that or a colleague. But if we do, so be it, I guess.
All right, go ahead, Joni.
I shared this in February at the League of Women Voters in terms of something that has to happen if we're going to combat racism, hate speech, all of that. And it comes from my experience here in Orlando when my husband became the first African American to be a judge in Orange County. and there was a group that organized a reception for the judges' wives, and I got the invitation, responded that I was coming, and got a call saying it was at the Orlando Country Club. And that the Orlando Country Club had a policy of no Jews, no blacks, and no dogs. I said, it is my intention to attend that function. So if you're going to call the police, you need to call them now because I'm coming. And I got a call. I got a call from a judge's wife. I had never met her. Her husband, Joe DeRocher, was a judge moving to the public defender's office. And Rosemary DeRocher called me and said, I understand that you're going to this reception for the judge's wife. And I said, yes. And she said, I'll come pick you up and we'll go together. So it can't just be my problem. It has to be our problem. And Rosemary's approach was, if they arrest you, they'll have to arrest me as well. So when we make it our problem, then we put a stop to it.
That's a wonderful story. And Judge Thompson is here also over here. Thank you for being here, Judge. All right, we said this was going to be a conversation, so that's what this is. We have some in the audience who wants to challenge something we talked about earlier. And I'll read this verbatim. It's all well and good to ignore the neo-Nazis when they come to town so as not to fuel their fire. But isn't that what the Jews did in Germany? They all ended up dead. Go ahead, Mitch. You were here.
The short answer to that is no. Nobody ignored the Nazis. Okay, they were responded to, but ineffectively. And here's something I didn't know if I'd have a chance to kind of flesh this out, but here goes. It's well known that Nazism destroyed German democracy. That was part of the process of coming to power and gaining total control over Germany. What's often less known is that they didn't really destroy the democracy single-handedly. In fact, what they did more than anything else was drive nails into the coffin, because the German democracy had already lost the support of wide and significant swaths of the German population, who didn't do so because they loved the Nazis. They did so because they lost faith in their democratic values and institutions. So one of the things that we have to do, and we should consider this as vigorous and positive opposition to groups like neo-Nazis, is we should strengthen our support for our democratic values and institutions. And I'll take a soapbox here just for a moment. It's become common in the United States of America for people to talk about the government as if it's somebody else. And the government is the problem, and the government is coming to do this or that. We are the government. This is the United States of America. This is our society. Nobody like the Nazis can take our society away from us without our permission. It was that permission that was given to the German Nazis that allowed them to do what they did. So it wasn't that the Jews didn't speak up. Of course, they were a tiny little minority. As Geraldine said, what they needed was the rest of everyone else to stand up for them too. And that didn't happen soon enough. So we have to profit by that example.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
For those who didn't hear me, as Christians, my husband and I, we attend an Orthodox synagogue only as guards every Shabbat. We would go occasionally to their Bible studies or their Torah studies. And actually on Shavuot a year ago, when they were studying, happened to be the night of the Pulse nightclub shooting. And many of the congregants were really rattled, and this could have just as easily been us. We don't feel comfortable coming to our synagogue anymore. And so we felt like, well, this is our moment. As some of you may have heard in France, Jews are uncomfortable going to their high holidays at Yom Kippur because it's unsafe to go to their synagogue. What would have happened in France if the Christians had controlled the synagogues so that it never got to that phase? I'm sure at one point in France everyone thought, well, that may happen there, but surely it will never happen here. So it can happen here, and there's 39 synagogues in Central Florida, and we're only guarding one. And I know there's other like-minded Christians that are looking for a more tangible way to support their community. You know, there's power when you stand up for yourself against hate, but when you stand up and unite with other groups that are experiencing hate, that's where we really have the power.
Following down here is Larry Bach, or Larry Back, of course. All right, I give this, you have to give it back.
I'll preface what I say by telling you that if I had been born the same year as my parents were in Poland, I had a 96% chance of being dead. I had a chance to travel to Europe in 1970, and I could not bring myself, at the age of 25, could not bring myself to enter into Germany. Later on, in 1995, I was glad to be in Germany. One of the reasons was that they have laws. They accept their guilt or whatever, and I have no problems with today's generation of Germans, but they have a law on the books. Don't make the Heil Hitler sign, don't be a Holocaust denier. And my question was, what is the slippery slope by having laws that prevent hate speech? Limited, you know, trying to draw a line.
Well,
This was actually the most fiery part of our exchange.
yeah. Again, as I tried to say, there is a negative aspect to a First Amendment right, and there's a positive aspect. And the Supreme Court has always taken the view that the First Amendment is restrictive on government. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Obviously, it's never been interpreted absolutely, because there's all kinds of things that we say that can subject us to punishment or civil liability. But if we take the view, which a lot of European countries don't, European countries provide a positive civil right guaranteeing freedom of speech, and in doing that, there's also the liberty that the government provides, that people are not offended by other people's speech. We have never taken that position. Now, again, a lot of advocates say that government should not play a neutral role in racist speech by just, hands off. That government should take a positive role, and especially because of our history of racial discrimination in the country. But again, I come back to, do you want the government, whoever the government might be at the time, and I appreciate what Mitch says, we are the government, do you want the popularly elected officials that sit in Congress or sit in the state? What?
I said, or electorally.
Okay, right. Thank you. Okay. Do you want them to decide what ideas are appropriate and what ideas are not? And again, when government starts deciding between viewpoints and different topics that are appropriate, we're going down that slippery slope, and Americans are different. Our First Amendment is different. Germany doesn't have a First Amendment. So,
can I add there?
Absolutely.
Please. This is probably going to get me in a lot of trouble if I get fired. I hope some of you are hiring. Our government has decided, they've made it very clear that white supremacy is acceptable. And that is my slippery slope. What do we do when our government allows it? You know, the organization I work for, we were awarded a $400,000 grant under the Obama administration to manage online interventions of violent extremists. Not just far-right extremists, but also ISIS-inspired extremists. That grant was rescinded under the current administration. And we are the only organization in the country doing what we do specifically for the far right. So that message has been sent loud and clear that it's okay. I mean, I've literally pulled up websites that are white supremacist websites saying, thank you. Thank you for backing the FBI up off of us now. Now we can go do what we want. And for me, I totally get do we want any government to be able to tell us, you know, what's okay and what's not, but I have to say they already are.
Yeah, and that's my point. We have an administration now that's supporting a position that most of us in this room find abhorrent. Another administration could come, like President Obama, and be very supportive to what you do. And so, again, I don't know, you know, I think we all have to, on a personal level, organizational level, speak out against the government's, you know, endorsement of speech and, you know, white supremacist groups that we abhor.
Maybe we can take the next step. How does that manifest itself? Because I think that's what a lot of people want to know when they leave from here. You're upset from what we saw last weekend. What do you do?
I would just like to say, and I think other people on this panel are much more expertise at answering that question. But for me, when I saw the candlelight vigil in Charlottesville the day after the demonstration and the killing, I found that to be a powerful, powerful response. Same thing when we had Pulse here. I mean, the response to hate is love, and not to love the haters, but to love us. And so to show that hate won't overcome love, and maybe that's a little naive, but I believe it.
And as a politician, I just have to stress that elections have consequences.
I would just add, as far as public safety, honestly, when those groups have their rallies, nothing would make me happier if other people would have their own rallies or stay home or ignore it. And I know there's a difference of opinion on that, but I agree when after Pulse, when we responded with love and kindness and compassion and showed the world how we respond, I think that's the way to do it rather than going and having to hear that type of rhetoric.
All right, we are getting close to the end of time. I'm going to take one more question from the audience. I'm sure these folks will stick around to chat afterwards, but this is actually a former coworker of mine, and I'm surprised nobody asked it before. I presume this is, yes, for Angela. No, you can only ask one question. You can't do that. You have to make a donation if you do.
I will. Angela, so I have a question for you. I have a question for you, too. My name's John Bustecker, by the way. I am a former coworker of Scott Maxwell here. What made you change your extremist views? And wait, I want to ask Scott one question, too. What do you think the media's role is in all of this, too?
That's a good one.
Unfortunately, I said we only had time for one more question. Angela.
Oh, sure. I was disarmed by kindness. I was in a prison for committing a hate crime, and one question changed my entire life. And that question was, hey, do you know how to play cribbage? And I have a potty mouth, so I'm not going to say what my response was. It had nothing to do with race. But that simple question, coming from a woman that I didn't feel like I deserved any kindness from, it disarmed me. I knew aggression, I knew anger, I knew violence. I didn't know kindness. And when it was shown to me, I couldn't show that anger back. But with that, I also want to, again, reflect what Senator Thompson said. It is not up to marginalized communities to teach us how to treat marginalized communities. We need to step up.
Well, John, I guess I would say, and I've given this some thought, because when people start talking about why don't we just ignore them, the easiest way, it would seem, would be that would start with the media, if there wasn't a single TV station that went to Charlottesville. But I'm going to tell you, I think, sort of like Terri said, that's not the job of the media, is to decide what events are happening. I think our job, ideally, is to be a reflection of what's happening in the community. And it may be a reflection of what's happening for 2 hours on that one street in Charlottesville, but if the media is doing its job, then it's to be a reflection of what's happening in the 2 days, and the 2 weeks, and the 2 months of that community's reaction afterwards. We fall short a lot of the time, although I'm going to say local newspapers do it better than most people. But yeah, I think our job is, when we're doing our best, is to be a reflection of the community, and my own personal motto, which is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, and I really like the second part of that a lot. All right. So we are going to conclude. I want to conclude with one thing, one vignette that I read out of Boston last week. It was a vignette about another far-right rally that was supposed to happen, and a bunch of protesters showed up, and they were itching for a fight. It is the story of a woman you may have seen her in the news, named Imani Williams. She's 27 years old, she's black, and she's from Connecticut, and she went ready to get into it with the white supremacists and against the Trump supporters. But when she saw a crowd of her fellow counter-protesters closing in around a group of Trump supporters, some yelling and even spitting, Imani decided to do something she hadn't gone there to do, and that was step up. She decided to protect the Trump supporters and escort them through the crowd to safety. When asked why she did that afterwards by the Boston Globe, Imani responded, "What better way to show them they are wrong? I couldn't get through a KKK rally with the same treatment, but we shouldn't be like them." Thank you all for coming. The panelists will stick around. I think Pam is going to say a few words before we go. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for coming and joining us tonight. My name is Pam Kancher, and it is my privilege to be the Executive Director of the Holocaust Center. Nelson Mandela said no one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Across America, conversations are being held, just like the one we had tonight, about the intersection of free speech and hate speech and whether it should remain protected under the First Amendment. As we've heard from our panelists and from you, hate in America has become too commonplace, and its many faces have the potential to tear our communities apart. The idea that one should avoid language or behavior that a group or individual might feel is unkind or offensive, often referred to as political correctness, is now being ridiculed. To many, it's more important to speak one's truth than to speak with respect. I do, however, believe that there is a silver lining. With the increase of hate rhetoric in our country, we are seeing an upsurge of people like us, willing to stand up and speak out against hate and injustice with stronger voices than ever before. The Southern Poverty Law Center recently released a guide outlining 10 principles for fighting hate that were on your chairs when you walked in tonight. With all due respect to them, I'd like to add an 11th. way to fight hate. We must commit to becoming better and more positive role models for our children. Children build character and empathy by watching and imitating our actions, habits, and attitudes, which will last them a lifetime. Let's model the behaviors and characteristics that we teach the students that participate in our Upstanders Stand Up to Bullying initiative. Social responsibility, compassion, cooperation, courage, integrity, ingenuity, self-sacrifice, and moral leadership. Building a world where diversity is celebrated and all people feel safe and respected begins with me, begins with you, and begins with us. Please join the movement to make hate history by going to our website at holocaustedu.org. For a minimum donation of $20, you can add your name to an ad that we are placing in the Sentinel this Sunday. Click on the Make Hate History button on our website, follow the prompts, and add your name to our ad. Please continue the conversation that we started tonight and join us on Tuesday, September the 12th at the Orange County History Center, where we will explore the intersection of media ethics and the law. Thank you to Scott Maxwell and our panelists.